Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alastair.
And in this 21st episode we'll be discussing the new Harry Potter prequel film Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, written by J.K. Rowling herself, with our guest Harry Potter correspondent Claire Rousseau, the Korean zombie film Train To Busan, and we'll be seeing what Alastair thought of my recommendation from last episode, which was the smash hit Cannibal Cop comic Chew. But before all that, Alastair, what have you been doing?
I've been watching a documentary that I found on BBC iPlayer.
Okay.
Now that we don't have BBC Three anymore, they're now making sort of BBC Three content that goes like directly onto iPlayer. There's been a few shows like that, and there's a documentary filmmaker I really like called Adam Curtis.
Oh, him.
Yeah, he's made quite a few very strange documentaries for the BBC over the years. He won a lot of awards for one in the early 2000s called The Power of Nightmares, which is kind of about the war on terror and how politicians use fear to manipulate people.
Yeah, no, I think I know him from doing a couple of bits on Charlie Brooker's shows. He's done like short segments for Screenwipe.
Yeah, Charlie Brooker seems to be a big fan of his. It's a very unusual sort of style of documentary filmmaking in that he talks over pre-recorded footage. He was an archivist and now has access to the entire BBC archive, so kind of edits archive footage together, old newsreel, bits of sort of music videos and films and things like that, and kind of talks over the top, telling his sort of narrative about, whatever topic it's on, and it's in a sort of one long polemic. And it's really interesting, really fascinating stuff. It's blurring the lines between documentary and sort of other works of like visual art, in that he brings in kind of music and abstract visuals to kind of create this whole experience rather than it just being a documentary that's about one topic.
Yeah, the stuff I've seen of his, which has been entirely his bits on Charlie Brooker shows, has been lots of black and white archive footage while his voice talks in a doomy fashion about the world's slowly descending into the apocalypse.
Yeah, that's pretty much what you get on the full documentaries, just in a longer fashion. If you've seen his clips on Charlie Brooker's shows, then that's pretty much what you get. Just longer and more drawn out, which means you can go into the kind of the topic in much more detail. And he always draws like connections between like recent history, technology. This one is more about how chaotic the world is and why the world seems so chaotic and uncertain, and why sort of politicians seem powerless to do anything about it, and sort of how, we perceive what is to be truth or certainty. So it's quite abstract, but it's really interesting, and it's a real experience. It's about 3 hours long, this one he's made. Now he's on BBC iPlayer. It doesn't seem to be restrained by any kind of length, but it's worth turning off the lights, sitting down, and kind of really immersing yourself in this kind of audio-visual documentary. Spectacular. So I'd recommend it.
But it probably won't make you happy, I'm guessing.
No, it will make you miserable. It will definitely make you. It will definitely make you miserable about how the world is spinning out of control, and there's nothing we can do about it.
But that's pretty much how all internet and media makes me feel at the moment, for the most part. So
it's timely.
It's timely, yeah. It's been a fun time to be on Twitter in the last few weeks. Yeah. But anyway,
what have you been up to since we last chatted?
I've been reading the comic run on Doom Patrol by Grant Morrison and, by various artists, but primarily Richard Case, I think. Doom Patrol is an old DC property from decades and decades ago, but like a lot of things, it was taken over in the 90s by a British writer with a slightly off-the-ball sensibility, in this case Grant Morrison, who's also known for high-profile runs on the Justice League and X-Men, and he's created his own sci-fi conspiracy theory series called The Invisibles, which I may well recommend you at some point because I think it might be the sort of thing you'd enjoy. But anyway, the Grant Morrison Doom Patrol run sort of takes these heroes whose main thing is they've been left in slightly odd states after horrible accidents, and they're sort of being rehabilitated by becoming superheroes, and really pushes the sort of the strangeness of it, like how disconnected they feel from the world, and then they have to take on villains who are even more out of the world than they are. There's one of the most famous storylines is called The Painting That Ate Paris, and which is literally what it's about. It's a painting that's eaten the city of Paris, and then Doom Patrol have to go into the painting to rescue it, and then things get a bit surreal.
That sounds good. That sounds like something I'd like.
Okay, maybe I'll recommend you that instead of The Invisibles. I don't know. There's plenty of time. But yeah, it's one of these often mentioned classics that I hadn't read. There's quite a lot of them. I'm working my way through them. So I bought Doom Patrol in a Comixology sale, I don't know, at some point in the last few months, and I finally got around to reading it. And yeah, it's great. Like all the really good Grant Morrison comics, it takes all this really off-the-wall surreal stuff, gets you used to its sort of logic, and then gives you a conclusion that is absolutely batshit, but also makes total sense within that logic, and it just, this weird feeling of being transported to another parallel reality. And Richard Case's arts isn't actually as odd as some of the people who sometimes work with Morrison, but to be honest, if anything, I think with Morrison, with the sort of general strangeness, sometimes often works better with artists who do just go, right, I'm going to draw this dead straight. This is like the sort of standard Western, semi-realistic superhero style, rather than going, oh yeah, I'm going to go fucking mental with this, weird proportions, people who look like long, thin, wobbly sticks. And yeah. Whereas drawing is in this sort of relatively conventional style, I think just makes it easier to get into the weirdness of it. So yeah, Doom Patrol by Grant Morrison. Read the whole thing in the last couple of weeks. Very good. Very, very good.
Yeah, sounds good. I like the idea of trying to accurately or without interpretation represent a kind of very surreal or strange story, because, and I think some way that makes it seem more realistic rather than the whole thing just take place in a world that is completely abstract.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, a lot of the time they're sort of tunnelling into this sort of strange other world and things grow steadily more weird. This sense of anchoring, I think, sort of helps it to work. Like, his Justice League and X-Men runs, a lot of the time were drawn in sort of fairly standard superhero-y styles, but then when the really weird giant bugs turn up or whatever, it just seems all the more unsettling.
Sounds good.
Anyway, as I say, I think some Grant Morrison is definitely coming your way at some point once I decide what the best Grant Morrison is to use.
Excellent.
Entirely coincidentally, someone's just retweeted a random comics journalist saying, just got off the phone with Grant Morrison. He's told me he's not scared because humanity is but one part of a growing organism. Then again, he also told me he only uses the internet a few times a year, so...
Fair enough then.
Okay, and first up today is Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, the new film in the, well, I would say the Harry Potter universe. Apparently it's now called J.K. Rowling's Wizarding World. And yes, this is directed by David Yates and screenwritten by Rowling herself, stars Eddie Redmayne as Newt Scamander, a magical zoologist trying to keep all the beasts safe from the big bad world. It's been described as a mix of Harry Potter, Pokemon and Doctor Who, and personally I like two of those things, so odds are sort of all right. Just for the record, since this is the big geek film release, there might be some spoilers. We're not going to bother doing a spoiler-free bit at the beginning, so if you're aggressively anti-spoiler, see the film, then listen to this. And second up, joining us again for our second Harry Potter bit, is blogger, booktuber and Potter fan Claire Rousseau. Hi.
Hi.
Hello, how's it going?
Good, thank you.
Excellent. Right, and since you're the guest, do you want to go first? What did you think of this film?
Well, I really liked it as a film. I thought it worked well, and it definitely had some really cute bits. I think the main problem for me is that it's in the Harry Potter universe, and they try to distance themselves as much as they can. It sounded from your intro like they're trying to distance themselves, but I'm not sure that they can. And so for me, there are things that don't work just because of what we already know from the Harry Potter world, and stuff in the movie that would make sense if it was like a new, different universe, but it doesn't because Harry Potter has rules and it kind of shits all over them.
I must admit, I'm not studious enough on the Harry Potter to pick up all the individual rule breaks, but yeah, I quite liked the way it at least felt vaguely standalone, like I didn't really need to know anything. It had an ending, which I quite liked, because I know this is the start of a 5-film franchise. In case you'd missed that update. Yes, I know. I felt much the same when I first heard. But to its credit, it didn't really feel like the start of an epic franchise. It didn't cliffhanger out too badly at the end. It had a beginning, middle, and a sort of a nice, conclusive-seeming ending.
No, that is true.
In this world of fucking epic cinematic universes, some of them are quite bad for that. I mean, some of them basically have, this is the start of a franchise, scrawled over them in neon, and this actually didn't. I'll give it that. I felt like I'd had a complete experience.
What I liked about this one was, because it wasn't based on a Harry Potter book, or not at least a Harry Potter novel, is that I did feel a little bit more in suspense, because I obviously didn't necessarily know how it was going to end. Because one of the problems with seeing Harry Potter films is you know what's going to happen because of the books. So what I did like about that is that this was different in that I didn't really know where it was going or how it would end.
Well, the world's not going to be destroyed, I suppose, but aside from that.
Well, aside from the usual film caveats of, good will triumph and evil will be vanquished, you didn't know specifically how.
Yeah, and another thing about that is that the Harry Potter books are so beloved. There is not really any way for someone who's a diehard Harry Potter fan to go and see a Harry Potter movie and not have a ton of complaints about it. And I mean, I still have complaints about this because there are things that I don't think work, but I don't have this whole like, well, the book did it so much better and the book is so important to me and they ruin this really important thing. Like, I'm still furious about the way that some of the Marauders plotline have been dealt with in the original series of movies based on the books, because those are very important pieces of the fictional universe to me, and then just not there.
The weird thing about the Harry Potter films, to me, was always that you did, or so I did, I don't want to impose myself on the listener, I always did feel like I was watching a sort of digest version of a book. I never really felt like they adapted it particularly fully. It just felt like it was, here are most of your favourite iconic scenes from the books on screen with a decent cast, and the fact that some of the connecting tissue has been lost or dramatically simplified doesn't matter, because let's face it, we all know it from the book.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That was one of the things that this film did better. I think that a lot of the Harry Potter films of the books do feel like quite heavily compressed and abridged, whereas I think this plot had a bit more breathing space because it was written to be a film plot and not basically adapted from an already existing book plot. Although one of my criticisms actually is I think the plot maybe had a little bit too much room to breathe. It did meander over the place a lot, and I thought some of the pacing was quite poor. I did find my attention wandering during certain bits, which I suppose we can go into more detail later if we wanted.
Yeah, I think this is a good place for someone who somehow, however they did it, managed to not be aware of Harry Potter before. If they wanted to jump in this film, they could. It's a good place for kids to start being into the story and the universe, although it is quite dark in places, but it definitely has some bits that feel like they've been put in for children's sake. Some of the humor in particular I thought was just, yeah. Much like The Hobbit, it has bits in it that feel like, oh, they've added some fart jokes for the children.
Yeah, I was like, I respect the fact it's written for the broad audience, though weirdly I feel like it's been marketed mostly as a Harry Potter prequel. Like, I don't know if it's really going to get a lot of people in who don't already care about Harry Potter, or at least know about Harry Potter.
I mean, they'd be mad to try and sell it any other way.
For some reason I don't feel like this has been quite a bigger selling point as it would have been, but this is the first proper bit of Potter material that Rowling has written solo since she wraps up the series. I actually kind of expected that to be a bigger deal, to be honest, but I don't really feel like it entirely has been.
And if you want to look at it that way, I definitely don't think it's the best Potter story if you take the books as a benchmark, but if you look at it just as a film in terms of how a film holds together, this is much, much better than something like Goblet of Fire, the movie, which is just like this breakneck pace series of scenes that make no sense unless you already know the book pretty well. So at least in that regard, it works pretty well. And again, the magical creatures are very, very, very cute. I did not think I would get that emotionally invested in, like, this twig insect's fate.
Yeah, I think the best part of the film were the titled fantastic creatures. They were like my favourite part. I really enjoyed every bit of the film when they were hunting the magical creatures. It was great. And the designs of the creatures were just brilliant. They were really original and colourful, and they looked really good, and they all had sort of, each one had a little like personality of its own. They really put a lot of time into designing these creatures, thinking out these creatures, how their scenes would work. You know, all the scenes when they were either trying to break into a bank vault or a jewellery shop or Central Park Zoo to try and recapture these escaped magical beasts. They were the best and most entertaining parts of the films.
I think a lot of it is just charm, yeah. I think the fact it is a charming film, and a lot of it is the magical creatures, and, you know, I guess that's where the Harry Potter collection comes in handy, because that's why you get enough money to do these amazing CGI beasts.
Yeah.
A lot of it is just the film trying hard to make you like it, by having the creatures being charming, and most of the characters being charming, and yeah, the fact that most of it works, and most of it lands, is one of the reasons why, even if the plot is a bit thin or slow at times, it's mostly quite entertaining and charming.
Yeah, exactly.
My main problem with the plot wasn't necessarily that it was slow, it was that it was very predictable, which is not something that I expect from J.K. Rowling's writing. The books have these great plot twists that you feel like suddenly you have to reread the whole book to view it in a new light. And here, the big plot twist that the guy who's been acting super evil the entire movie is in fact evil.
Yeah.
It just doesn't... You know, I mean, you see this guy who maybe for 5 minutes you wonder if he's evil or not, and then suddenly he's trying to, like, gaslight and manipulate this child who clearly has some issues into finding him a powerful child. I mean, it's just really obvious he's going to be the bad guy, and I was disappointed in that.
I was half expecting the twist actually would be that the person you thought was the villain wasn't the villain, because that would have been quite a good twist.
I don't know, it would almost have been more interesting if he'd just been a bit overzealous and sleazy, rather than actually being a supervillain.
And you have that in the original series. You have that working really, really well with Barty Crouch Sr. as, like, this character who's just implacable in pursuit of what he thinks is the right thing to do, and therefore becomes almost monstrous because he will just put his son to jail. And that was a super interesting plotline. And in this film, what I thought was interesting was that the kind of extremely creepy kids, which I thought were a bit much, you see this Credence, the young guy in question who the bad guy manipulates, you see him, and visually he is very, very much styled in the same way as young Tom Riddle is in the original movies, like this kind of drab filming, and it's in kind of bluish greenish tones, and he's got this like really, really stark haircut, dark hair, like he just looks like young Voldemort, and you kind of expect that manifests in him being maybe evil, but then it turns out, it's the other side of the same coin of Voldemort having this terrible childhood. It's just this kid is a victim, and then just gets murdered by the government because it's a really dark movie.
Yeah, it is. It's also maybe it's just because I saw it in 3D, but it was literally visually a very dark movie. There were scenes where I was a bit sort of, what's happening here?
No, we saw the 2D, yes. But it was quite dark, especially a lot of the night scenes. I don't know if that was done to provide contrast for when they go inside Newt's magical suitcase and it's all vibrant and bright. I don't know if that was done to provide contrast, or maybe to make the magical creatures, which are also quite brightly coloured, sort of contrast to the grey and pale muggle world, or no-mage, as they call them in America. But there were a few scenes that were quite dark in visual tone as opposed to story tone.
So did you think it went off at the end then? Did you lose interest when the magical creatures went away?
Yeah, I didn't really truck with the wider plot, I guess. The plot that wasn't so much to do with Newt and tracking the magical creatures, which I felt very much was this like extra story that was needed to set up the 5-film franchise. It felt very much like they had this great idea. They're going to adapt a book that was originally written for children in need, I think. The textbook from the Harry Potter universe, the magical creatures and where to find them. They thought, we'll make this into a film about magical creatures, great. Can also have something about the wider politics of the wizarding world and set up another 4 films in that. And I was like, well, those plots to me seemed very bolted on at the end. They were very poorly paced. The plot kind of meandered quite seemingly needlessly. I don't really know why there was several detours involving politicians that seemed just to really pad it out a bit. So the magical conspiracy wider plot really didn't work for me. But I did enjoy Newt and co hunting magical beasts.
I would absolutely agree with that, and I think the biggest plot holes and the biggest issues with the whole thing come from that. You have the fact that the creepy little girl that the bad guy Colin Farrell wants to utilize for her magic, she has a wand. Like, where did she get that? Within the Harry Potter universe, you have to go to someone who's a specialist and you have to pay money for that. Like, there's literally no way she can have a wand. And then you have Colin Farrell changing into Johnny Depp Grindelwald for reasons that, like, are just completely unnecessary, except for having this transition to a famous actor with all the problem that involves. But that's not something that can happen within the magical world. Like, we don't know of a spell where you can just change your appearance. Like, there you have to do a potion and you have to go through all this stuff. When we have someone who takes Polyjuice for an entire movie to change his appearance, which we've had before, you see him do it so that you can, when you watch it again, say, aha, this is where this started happening. And then everything else is, again, like an issue that is with that overall plot. Like, the little girl that Colin Farrell / Grindelwald wants to use, she disappears completely at the end of the movie. We don't know what happens to her. There is a small, terrified, magical child that is loose in the city, and that apparently is enough to, like, create a beast that is going to maybe kill people.
I mean, I might be about to expose my idiocy, but isn't the point that he thought the Obscurus was the girl, but it's actually Credence, and therefore the little girl was just a dummy?
That's what I thought.
I agree. But the little girl has now witnessed quite a lot of trauma, and she still lives in the house of, like, a cult leader, crazy lady who, like, beats children. And even though she's not around anymore, like, you can't imagine there's going to be a good environment. There's a government body that acts the same way that the Ministry of Magic does, but clearly they don't mix with the no-mage, but they don't have any way of recruiting magical children out of abusive situations like that could cause exposure of the wider wizarding world. Like, it's like Alastair said, like, all the bits where the magical creatures make sense, and whenever it goes to the setup of the wizarding world in America as different from the setup of the wizarding world in the UK, it doesn't really work. There's a really great piece over at the Daily Dot by Gavia Baker-Whitelaw about the way that the politics don't really make sense in an American context.
Yeah, I don't think it was really trying to say anything substantial about the politics, was it? I mean, as I say, the film is focusing on, here's some charming characters, here's some cute beasts, here's an exciting action film. I don't really get the feeling it was trying to say anything deeper. I know it's Rowling's first ever screenplay, as far as I'm aware, or certainly her first ever produced screenplay, so maybe she'll get more into that later, or maybe this is basically a pilot episode and we'll see more depth later. But either way, I didn't get the feeling it was trying to do much beyond a bit of setup with the politics stuff. Mostly because you had Scamander and his Pokemon hunt being the sort of the main focus of the plot, so you didn't really have to. Honestly, I think a lot of the resolution to the little girl is, would anyone have known about her or cared? I mean, she doesn't actually have magical powers. For starters, wouldn't she have been obliviated at the end of the film by the hawk rain or whatever it was?
Oh, you mean the magical rain that only works when the plot needs it to work?
Yeah, that was a bit of a big ask, wasn't it? I mean, it was quite a nice emotional sequence with Jacob Kowalski. But yeah, for doing the whole city, it was a bit of a weird one.
It was a bit of a magical get-out right at the end of the film that basically they can just sort of undo everything quite neatly at the end, especially after their big sort of climactic action set piece that kind of reveals the existence of magic to everyone in New York. But because I quite liked the Kowalski character, I thought he worked well as a character in the film. You know, as partly as being a no-mage, he was like the kind of, like Harry Potter is in the original books, someone who knows nothing about the world. Therefore, the other characters can explain things the audience needs to know to him. He worked quite well as that. I thought the character had some depth and personality and was well acted. And I did like his little moment at the end when he realises that he has to have his memory erased, and, you know, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. He's not, you know, he's supposed to go back to his regular boring life and forget all about the wonderful magic. I did like his last little moment when he chooses to sort of have his memory erased by going out into the memory wipe rain. That was a nice bit, little sort of nuggets of filmmaking, but the kind of bits before and after that were a bit of a letdown.
It's a good sort of swelling emotional moment. It's one of the reasons why the film works as a whole, because it has these big emotional bits and they mostly work and they're happening to a character you've been made to care about due to all the charm, so therefore it sort of just about works.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, however, the magic obliviating rain, you know, it starts and immediately I was thinking, what about people that are indoors? Because it's magical rain and it's outside. And you have a bunch of establishing shots showing you that it actually works on people indoors. Showing you some characters that you followed throughout the movie, like the bank teller who wouldn't give Jacob a loan. And it shows you that it works on these people as well, even though they're indoors. But then you have Jacob who's in like this underground stop. Clearly, if the rain is working indoors, it should work on him when he's right there. But it doesn't, so that you can have this emotional moment. And to me, probably because the magic rain thing already felt like, oh, well, now they're going to find a way to erase everything and, you know, put the stakes back to zero, like they do at the end of every episode of Buffy, where somehow Sunnydale doesn't remember about vampires even though they see them every week. Because I was already kind of annoyed with that, I was just looking at it like one of those overblown death scenes, you know, where someone takes 20 minutes to die so they can have a monologue. Which, I mean, you know, I suppose if you want to say that this has a bit of Doctor Who in it, then it can be that, as well as the, like, magical case that's bigger on the inside.
Well, that is one way it was sort of slightly undercut by its connection to Harry Potter, I guess, because obviously, unless she's going to do some really impressive cosmic retconning, you know that the magic will be secret again by the end of the film. So, as a result, you're sort of sitting there even during the bit where the Obscurus is smashing up the city, going, well, this is going to have to be heavily obliviated, isn't it? Which does take you out of the story for a few seconds.
Yeah, they could have worked around that. I mean, like, for example, they could have set the climax inside the Ministry of Magic and have that been destroyed rather it being the subway, because then that would be outside the No-Maj world. I'd also like to take this opportunity to think that I really thought the design of the Ministry of Magic was really, really good. It just looked really impressive and spectacular. That was a definite full use of the cinematic scope to convey a sort of very unusual magical place. There was the Ministry of Magic in New York. I really liked the period setting for the whole thing, actually. I thought they worked it. It was nice and different to what we're used to from Harry Potter, the kind of contemporary stroke, slightly Victorian setting that they have.
I mean, I think it was mostly as the backdrop, though. I mean, it's not as if, I don't know, except for the slightly different politics of the Magical Congress, the Bakuza. Sounds like Yakuza. Probably not deliberate. There wasn't much you couldn't have done if the film was also set in London. I mean, I guess the idea is that the Magical Congress used to be a bit more militant about, aggressively wiping memories and aggressively not ever letting anyone find out.
I guess that maybe they're trying to make a point about American segregation, that how the No-Maj and the magical people are completely forbidden to mix in any way. They never have interaction with each other. They exist in separate spheres.
Yeah, well, there's a point that Gav made in her article, which I thought was great. I hadn't thought about it, but yes. For people who are completely segregated from the Muggles, those wizards dress really well in Muggle clothes. When we spend a large portion of the Harry Potter books laughing at, adult men wearing nightgowns to the Quidditch World Cup because they don't know how to dress like Muggles.
No, yeah. That's a good point.
The thing is, those films are always beautiful. The set design is always wonderful. The costumes are always really great. They have money to spend on that, and they do spend it, and it always looks wonderful. But sometimes the question is, you made it look cool, but have you thought about what you're saying about it? So they wanted to have a scene in a speakeasy with a mobster, so they put in a goblin, which doesn't help with the fact that in the original series, the goblins were already coded quite heavily as Jewish. And now, that there was the whole, they're not trustworthy because they don't have the same concept of ownership, and they're bankers, and, all that kind of stuff. And now you have that, plus also they're mobsters, and they betray the heroes.
Were they goblins or house elves? There was a line of dialogue about being house elves. Were they not all house elves?
The barman was a house elf, and the rest of them were goblins, but I thought that they looked a little bit too similar, that it was a bit difficult to tell, actually, as well.
Yeah, I would agree that I found it difficult to tell between what was supposed to be a goblin and what was supposed to be a house elf. I don't know if I've seen the Harry Potter films as many times as you have to be as au fait with them, but I did find that slightly confusing. Although I would say on the whole, I do take your point about, which I hadn't thought of till you said, but it's very valid, that if the goblins are codified as being slightly Jewish, having them as sort of mobsters and, money lenders and the powers behind the scenes is somewhat problematic, to say the least. But I hadn't thought of that before I came to this point, which is I did actually quite like the speakeasy scene. It was another way to use the culture and the sort of environment of the 1920s to do something a bit different, like having a speakeasy than what we've seen in Harry Potter's before. I also thought it had some quite good comedy set pieces, mainly coming from the Kowalski character, him trying to sort of play it cool with all the magical creatures saying, oh yeah, I like elves. My uncle was an elf.
That was
and also the bit they order giggle water, and he just drinks it and then just bursts out giggling maniacally for a second, just completely impromptu, and then he does it again later. I know that was probably the biggest laugh of the whole film for me. The sort of Kowalski manic giggling with a surprised expression after drinking giggle water.
Yeah, I quite liked the Tina character, actually. I saw one review, I think it might have been Bob Chipman's review, I'm not sure, which said that he felt in some ways she was probably been a better lead character and Scamander was a bit of a weird lead character, which...
Yeah, I like Tina a lot.
I don't know, could go either way, but I think they could have given her more to do, maybe.
She had a good story arc with being an aura and then being thrown out for breaking the magical rules, but doing the right thing and trying to protect the aforementioned abused child from the cult leader.
Although, again, it's not exactly morally ambiguous, I suppose. The character was thrown out for being an aura because she was just too nice to abuse children. You're not really struggling with your liking of that character, are you?
No, but it provides some depth, and also it kind of illuminates the world this is taking place in.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that Tina would have been a fine main character, but I think the idea behind following Newt Scamander as the bumbling Englishman is partly to do what you were saying, Alastair, with Kowalski, where he's coming from the outside as a No-Maj and seeing what's going on in the magical world, and then Newt is coming from the outside as an Englishman seeing what's going on in the American magical world. So we've got that. And I think if Newt weren't our protagonist, would probably get quite annoyed with him because he does do a lot of things that, you watch and you're like, no, don't do the thing. I think if you were following from Tina's point of view, you would get rightly irritated at some of the stuff that Newt Scamander does. But then clearly she likes him by the end of the movie, and if he's the main character of the next one, which I have no idea what's going to happen in the next movie, but if he's the main character again, then we will probably see her again, since he's going to bring her his book in person.
They also seem to imply at the end that Grindelwald knew Newt. There was a moment of recognition between them at the end. So I assume that's how he's going to be in the future ones.
Well, they were being a bit cagey about all Newt's backgrounds, which was in some ways kind of weird, considering he's the main character. You didn't really, apart from the fact that he's, a kind zoologist with a TARDIS suitcase, you didn't really get to know that much about him, except a few hints, which I'm guessing are for future films.
If they hadn't introduced the whole thing about how he knows one of the Lestranges, you could think possibly, are we going to see him again? Does Grindelwald actually know him? We know that Newt is aware of Grindelwald's politics because he quotes the greater good when he's in the interview with Colin Farrell's character, whatever his name was. When he's in that interview, he says, am I going to make a disturbance for the greater good? No, I'm not one of Grindelwald's. So that's already a phrase that's known in Europe. He already knows about that. So is it perhaps because the Lestranges went over to Grindelwald and he broke off his friendship and or romance with Lady Lestrange for that reason? That seems like the most likely thing for J.K. Rowling to write. That seems like a very J.K. Rowling thing to write. I'm going to go with that.
There was a moment at the end when Grindelwald looks at Newt and says, every time we die a little, which I believe is a reference to that song that goes, every time we say goodbye, we die a little. So implying
How old is that song?
Not sure, I could look it up. But that implies that they've said goodbye to each other before.
We know that Grindelwald knew Albus Dumbledore quite a few years ago, when you consider that he knew Dumbledore when he was something like 18 or 19. He was very young, and in this film he doesn't look very young at all. He looked like he's 50 and has done a lot of drugs. So
the moustache didn't really work for me, it has to be said, but maybe it'll grow on me in future films.
Stupid. The hair was so stupid.
And the worst part is that's probably the least weird shit Johnny Depp's had on his face for about the last 20 roles, so
It's entirely possible that Grindelwald and Newt Scamander know each other. Newt Scamander, that sounds like a pretty wizarding name to me. It doesn't seem like he would be necessarily a Muggle-born. But I was also quite interested with the information that Newt Scamander's been expelled from Hogwarts. Ever since I've heard that, I can't stop thinking about Newt Scamander and Hagrid hanging out and having tea and talking about the crazy magical creature they got expelled for. And just I want someone to make some art or write some fluffy fan fiction about Newt Scamander coming to see Hagrid when he gets expelled and telling him, mate, you're going to be okay because I got expelled because of a magical creature too, and now I'm a famous author.
Is Hagrid meant to be that old? I can't remember. I think he must be, surely.
We don't know how old Newt lives to be.
Yeah, I don't even know if Newt's meant to still be
true.
alive at the time of the original Harry Potter books. I guess if they're in the sort of early 2000s, Newt would have to be in his 80s or something.
Wizards live longer than humans.
In fact, he'd be incredibly old, wouldn't he? Because it looks like this is the 20s, and he looks like he's in his 30s. So, yeah, he'd be coming up to a century by the time the books start.
Probably about the same age as Dumbledore.
Right. But wizards live longer than humans, so Dumbledore is apparently 150 by the time he dies, so there is that. There is also the fact that we know that Newt Scamander has a grandson at some point because his grandson Rolf Scamander marries Luna Lovegood, so at least we know he doesn't die without having any progeny, so maybe he's safe for another, at least time to get together with a person of the Lady Persuasion and have some children. And also, Hagrid was at school at the same time as Tom Riddle. And it's about 50 years before the original series. They say in the Chamber of Secrets that it's 50 years since the chamber was last opened. So that's about the time frame.
Scamander's a few years older than both Hagrid and Tom Riddle then, probably.
Yeah, because Grindelwald is the first, bit of the cycle that we know. There's obviously... The real first bit of the cycle is Salazar Slytherin, but a lot of things are extremely cyclical about the Harry Potter books, and the circle of, like, good and evil is something that comes back again and again and again. You know, you have Gellert Grindelwald, who wants to subdue muggles for the greater good. Dumbledore beats him down. Well, Dumbledore beats him in magical combat and defeats him. Then you have Voldemort, who wants to subdue all the muggles for his own good, and Harry defeats him. And then you have, if you consider the Cursed Child to be canon, which I'm wobbly about because I don't like it at all, but in that you also have someone who comes along who wants to be the new Voldemort, albeit by bringing Voldemort back. But you have this cyclical nature of, you know, we don't change, we always have this animosity, this fight between the Muggleborns and the purebloods, and then the Muggles, and then the magical world. There's no living together, there's no real evolution. You have this world that's kind of stuck in the past and that's repeating the same mistakes. And this is the first iteration of it.
I thought you said the first iteration was Salazar Slytherin.
Yes, I did say that. I mean, this is the first modern iteration of it. Thank you. I made this great speech, and then you poked holes in it. Although, frankly, they were there. But still.
It was just one hole at the very end, it's fine. You did make the same criticism yourself earlier, of yourself. Well, anyway. But yeah, I'm assuming there'll be a 5-year TV show called Game of Wands or something about the original Hogwarts founders at some point in the next few years. I mean, Game of Wands is obviously the porn version of... But it's not the porn version of Game of Thrones, is it? Because that's Game of Bones.
Game of Swords?
We have wandered way off topic.
I mean, obviously the porn version of this is Fantastic Breasts and Where to Find Them, but that's neither here nor there.
Which my phone keep autocorrecting beasts to.
Okay.
The soundtrack album is hopefully called Fantastic Beats and Where to Find Them. But anyway, I've exhausted those two jokes now.
I'm confused by the person who doesn't know where to find fantastic breasts. Surely that is quite obvious.
There's no internet in the 20s, Alastair. They've got no way of finding them.
It was the 20s. Yeah.
Oh dear.
It was a more liberal time.
That's what the speakeasy is for. The speakeasy where they have either a goblin lady or a fairy lady or something singing the blues with, like, this really tiny, tiny dress that does not at all hide the fact that they've designed this magical creature to be, like, very human female-like in shape. The goblins and the house elves don't at all look like the same shape as, like, a buff dude.
Yeah.
But the ladies look like hot human ladies.
Was there a female goblin in the Harry Potter films? I'm sure you'd know if there was. I can't remember one.
No, I don't think there is.
I was confused who that piece of slightly salacious entertainment was supposed to appeal to, because it didn't seem like it would appeal to humans or goblins, just someone who had kind of a sexual fetish for both. It's quite niche. I think they may have wandered into the fetish club as well as the speakeasy.
I mean, I don't know, it just felt like it was so obviously something that was designed for the viewer of the film rather than to fit in the universe of the movie, so it was, like, just, I
think it was just a bit of a sort of jokey reference to that being the sort of thing you'd normally see in a speakeasy scene in a film, and the fact that it doesn't fit with the established universe at all is neither here nor there, I guess.
Yeah.
Unless it is here for you.
We've had a message in from regular listener Kirsty. She wanted to contribute to this, that she thought this film lacked tension, that there wasn't any moment of real peril, that she felt that there was a place when you really thought like something really bad could happen to the main characters. I think I'd agree with that. The only time I think when I kind of got to that was when there's the kind of snake creature that's growing to be very, very big and could, accidentally crush them if they're not careful. I did feel the tension in that moment, but I do think that it is possible that there was a lack of tension, especially in the Colin Farrell Grey's non-creature related story, which again sort of lacked tension apart from at the end when they had a kind of special effect explosion, which isn't usually the best way to inject tension at the end of a film.
I did feel some degree of tension or worry because I actually genuinely hoped the Credence character would get out of it alive. And then he didn't, so, at least they went through on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What I felt was a missed opportunity was to have a bit more tension with Jacob's character. He seems to be going along for the ride, mostly because it's really cool, which is something that I can definitely sympathize with. However, at the beginning of the film, he's going for a bank loan, and he doesn't get the bank loan, and then he gets pretty much caught red-handed with Newt, like, raiding a bank vault. and the bank manager knows his name. I was thinking, when is Jacob Kowalski going to realize that the bank manager is like going to the police with his name? If he knows that they're going to obliviate him, couldn't he say, I'm gonna help you if you go and like wipe the memory of the bank manager who saw you rob a bank and then saw me at the bank with you?
Yeah.
That would have been such an easy bit to add. It would have fit really well.
And obviously you could just write it out easily at the end, because it would have to go with the obliviation, because he saw Newt doing magic at the same time. So it wouldn't even know how to stay.
No,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
But I did think Dan Fogel played the part very well. Generally, I thought the most of the principal players were very good. Eddie Redmayne was very watchable as Newt. I would certainly watch him again reprising this character. It reminded me a lot of Matt Smith doing Doctor Who.
There's a lot of that in there,
Yeah, it was good fun. I'd watch Catherine Waterston reprise Tina. I think the Kowalski character, as good as he was, I like the fact that his story was told and it had a resolution, and that meant, I think I prefer his character was left there, because, I'm not really sure whether they could do more with that character, but I'd like to see those characters return. Colin Farrell's okay as Graves, just very much...
I think he's gone, it's fine.
Traditional villain, too obviously creepy. But yeah, I thought the principal parts did their roles very well.
I'm assuming they're never going to dig into whether there's a real Graves who Grindelwald replaced.
I doubt it.
But I'm assuming he just had Polyjuice potion strapped to his inner thigh or something, which he was gently sucking during breaks. I mean, maybe...
What, like a beer hat of Polyjuice potion?
I'm amazed that hasn't come up. At least at like parties or like the Quidditch World Cup or something. But yeah, I think I liked the ending more than most people. I thought it was a rare blockbuster, but didn't trail off completely at the end and just become pixels smashing into each other. I mean, maybe I've had my standards battered down by the glorious two-hander of Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad, which both just descended into nightmarish CGI clanging. But I actually thought this had a decent ending bit, which at least felt like it had some stakes and mattered, and then led into some actually good emotional bits.
It was certainly better than those two disasters that you mentioned before. And, the ending was they resolve the creature's plot and then they proceed to the kind of obscurus, evil wizarding world plot that, as I said before, I wasn't so keen on. I mean, the ending was better than it certainly could have been, and they avoided some obvious pitfalls that a lot of films fall into, just like having a giant CGI monster at the end that everyone just shoots lightning at with constipated expressions until it dies, which has certainly been a criticism of some films this year. And I like the fact there was a kind of a three-way fight at the end, in that there was a various different ones. The monster was trying to destroy things. Graves was trying to take the monster's power for evil. Newt and Tina were trying to save the poor kid that kind of was possessed by the monster or wrapped up in it. And the enforcers of the Wizarding World were trying to destroy it. Having multiple factions warring, and I thought that worked quite well, and it also certainly, as you said, wasn't resolved the way I thought it would be resolved. So there were nice things about the ending. I know that whole plot had kind of lost me at that point.
So yeah, I think with a lot of these sort of spin-offs to existing franchises, the question people always seem to come back to, possibly even to an unfair degree, I don't know, is did this justify its own existence? Did it bring enough new into the world to justify the time and money spent making it?
That's the point to me. The film justifies its own existence as a film quite well, because it works, it's cute, it's a fun evening out at the cinema. It's certainly, even though I found it irritating at times, it did not make me half as angry as, say, Age of Ultron did. But as part of the Harry Potter universe, when the basis that we have for, is this a good Harry Potter thing, is this sprawling series of books that built this universe in so much detail that is so important to so many people. Like, I feel like they were just setting themselves up for failure, because there's no way with one movie they can make something that lives up to just the vast amount of detail that there is before. Of course, that's my point of view, and your mileage may vary, and I'm sure that for some other people it's just a platform to build on, and it's something that helps kind of prop up the extra material, and you can watch it and think, oh, this is great, and look at all the callbacks that they make to the earlier stories. But for me, this is something that I've spent years and years critically analyzing and being really obsessive about, and going into it in probably way too much detail, spending time on this that could be spent productively on something else. And so I'm not going to now stop nitpicking about it, because that is just what I do when you put a Harry Potter thing in front of me. And I think a lot of the fandom has a similar experience.
Don't feel bad. It's helped this podcast no end.
It's good nitpicking. It's very good nitpicking.
Well, if I told my 13-year-old self who was like getting really obsessed about Harry Potter, like, don't worry, in like 15 years' time you'll be a Harry Potter correspondent on this thing that's gonna exist called a podcast. I would have been pretty happy.
And you've achieved other things in your life too, so that's even better. Right.
Yeah.
Well, you say this.
I don't think I meant to deconstruct the value of the lives of our guests, so I wasn't going to say that.
For me, I would agree that it does justify its existence as a film, because I think it was substantially different from the regular Harry Potters in that, well, the other Harry Potters, I should say, is that it was set in a different time, a different place, slightly different wizarding culture, different characters. It did seem like a different enough thing in its own right to be interesting. And the story also seemed to be, at least for now, completely separate in that or at least to a degree separate from the original Harry Potter stories. Nathan Deitman, film critic and games critic, had a great piece on the problems with the Star Wars prequels, the older ones in the timeline, or a lot of prequels introduced later, is that they lack tension because you ultimately know how that end, and which is they'll end in the position the pieces were for the beginning of the thing they're prequeling. So that takes the tension away. This story, although we know that Grindelwald will eventually be defeated, we kind of know it's going to happen anyway, because in these stories good always triumphs over evil, but we don't really know what the future or really the fate of these characters are, or what other circumstances will arise in the process. So that tension is still present. This story is separate enough that there is a tension that we don't know what will happen. This story does not exist as, say, the Star Wars prequels did, or the Hobbit as Lord of the Rings prequels. This story doesn't just exist to maneuver various pieces into the position they were at the beginning of the Philosopher's Stone.
Yeah, and it was much better as a story that hangs together than The Cursed Child, the play, which, the play was pretty impressively staged and whatever, but this was also a really impressive movie visually, and the story works a lot better.
Cool. Anyone got anything they desperately wanted to mention and haven't? No? Yes, maybe?
Johnny Depp is gross and abusive, and he shouldn't be in this movie.
Yeah, I'm going to assume they signed some sort of contract with him before all that came out, because these things take a fucking eternity to make.
There's always clauses in any contract to get out of them if, like, the other person, say, commits a crime. They did fire a kid from the original movie franchise because he was caught with, like, pot on him or something. So you'd think if they wanted to fire Johnny Depp because he allegedly abused his wife, then they could do that. They just decided not to, and I think that's kind of gross.
It is weird, if only because you'd think, in brand terms...
Exactly.
Johnny Depp's, even before the whole domestic abuse thing came out, it's been a while since people heard Johnny Depp is in this film and thought, yes, good, let's go see it.
Yeah.
Before the alleged domestic abuse thing, maybe this was seen as a sort of a rehabilitation or a change of direction for him, I don't know. Maybe playing an actual villain instead of a quirky good guy is meant to be something new. Or maybe he just thought, fuck it, I'm a Hollywood actor, it's time to appear in a nerd franchise. Everyone's doing it, need the money.
I did see people on Twitter saying that Mads Mikkelsen would have been much better casting. He is in everything else this year, so he might as well be in this as well.
As long as it's not Benedict Cumberbatch, if you're going to put someone who's in everything.
To be fair, Mads Mikkelsen's part in Doctor Strange was so thin, that he probably have done better in this, although, I don't know, he probably had time to do both, to be honest, considering that Grindelwald, in his own form, was only on screen for about 2 minutes.
It just seemed a bit pointless. I think for me, the idea that, there's a bad guy in your midst and you thought he was like a nice man that you worked with because he was being polite and everything, and then he turns out to be a wacky sociopath who wants to kill all the muggles, is a lot more terrifying than he transformed into this weird looking dude.
One of my favourite things about the original Harry Potter book, the Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, is that partly because I read it and I thought, it's so obvious that Snape's the evil one, it's so obvious. And you get to the end and he's not. And it's a great twist because, especially when I was a teenager reading a book aimed at younger children, I thought this book is going to be transparent because it's aimed at younger children, and it caught me out. And this film didn't do that.
Well, that's what I was saying about Graves. I mean, it would have been more interesting, arguably, if Graves was well-intentioned but just incredibly sleazy and without scruples.
Yeah.
And ended up being a sort of a bureaucratic version of Snape, instead of just being, he looks like the villain, he smells like the villain, he is the villain.
I just think it's really surprising to see something like that from Joe Rowling, to see that there's not a twist, And the plot is the bit that doesn't work, because intricate plotting is kind of what the books are best known for. You know, this is like really complex stories that hang together really well over these 7 books. And I don't know, maybe once all 5 movies have come out, we'll be able to see some threads that weave in and out of all of them, and it'll make more sense, and we'll think, yes, that totally makes more sense now. But as it stands, I'm very surprised that it's just predictable.
The second installment is set to be released on 16th November 2018.
Yeah.
So yeah, back in 2 years, guys. And then maybe we'll see what happens next.
So that's, I think, all we've got time for discussing Fantastic Beasts and where to find them. It's good news that there will be a sequel, as we seem to have broadly liked it. Claire, I'm sure we'd love to have you back. Would you like to take this opportunity to tell the lovely MFV listeners where they can find your output?
So you can find me online at Claire Rousseau on Twitter, and also at youtube.com/user/Claire Rousseau. And if you can put a link somewhere for the lovely people so they don't have to spell my name, that would be awesome.
Yep. I'll type it into the website in the show notes. It's all good.
Woot.
Okay, cool. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
See you again.
Bye.
Bye.
Next up, we will be discussing Train to Busan, a Korean zombie movie. Yo-gong is taking his daughter, Soo-an, to Busan to visit her mother for her birthday. There's only one problem. Zombie uprisings have broken out across Korea and in major cities, and one of the infected is on the train. What follows is tense and bloody, high-speed zombie horror movie. Nick, how do you think this compared to some other recent zombie films or TV shows you've seen?
What, you mean like those 7 years of The Walking Dead, for example? Yeah, it was very good. It was another... I remember back when we did Star Trek Beyond. I know it's an odd comparison, but stay with me. Well, I think my first comment was, my first note really is solid as fuck. And this is very much another entry from the solid as fuck oeuvre, I think. I don't think boundaries are being redefined here, but it's very, very good and strong at what it's trying to do, which is make a straight-up zombie film in the backdrop of a train. Because, the gimmick here, which, I don't think is a huge spoiler, it's in the title and it gets cut to it within about 10 minutes. The entire film, pretty much, except for a few minutes at the beginning and kind of a few bits at the end, takes place on a train. It's basically a claustrophobic zombie thriller where they're stuck on a train, which at first is their outpost against the zombie apocalypse, and then quickly becomes, you may be surprised to hear the zombies are there as well. So, if you like zombies and you like the idea of a zombie film where the gimmick is zombies on a train, like snakes on a plane, I guess, then it's really good. It's really solid. It's very exciting and well paced, and the effects are, impressive as in gruesome. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, I think the setting this film on a train was a really good idea. I've seen a lot of zombie films, zombie TV shows, zombie video games, zombie everything, and I think you do need something different if you're doing a zombie thing to have to really connect with the audience, because we've seen a lot of stuff like I really liked In the Flesh. That was a different take on zombies. That was zombies who'd been cured and turned back into regular people and were treated with suspicion. This was obviously a more straightforward zombie thing, but setting it all on a train and having kind of using the sort of iconography of trains a lot was good. Like there was people hiding in those sort of cramped train toilets. There was they used tunnels at various points because the zombies can't see the humans when they go through tunnels. So I thought it was a way of doing a zombie film, but doing it a bit differently to make it original.
Yeah, I wasn't going to rush to dish out the originality prizes because it's still, generic, solid zombies for the most part. It's just that this time they're on a train. Whereas In the Flesh, I think it didn't reinvent the genre, but it definitely had a fresh take on it.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't think this does as much with zombies as In the Flesh did, but it's, the train thing makes it feel slightly different. It did make me like the idea of, because most of my zombie experience, to be honest, is Walking Dead, which is obviously set in a dystopia where they sort of gloss over the part where the zombies rise up in a populated world in a sort of jump at the beginning. So that at least did make it stand out from that, the fact that this was actually in the populated world where there are still populated cities.
I thought they handled that quite well with a real kind of good build-up of tension, how it starts with there's a few sort of odd things going on, like they're driving to the station and there's like just sort of fire engines and police cars like just shooting the opposite direction, and they're like, oh, something's going on, but I'll just ignore it. And then sort of stranger things happen, and then you see kind of people attacking each other at the station. At the last minute, before the doors shut to the train, someone in a sort of slightly disheveled state throws himself onto the train, and then it does quite well building up.
Yeah, and plus when they were just pulling out, there was the good comic beat of the guard bloke on the station platform just standing there, and then bang, he gets hit by a zombie diving across the screen. I mean, I think they did that joke a couple of times, but it never stops being funny.
Yeah.
In fact, yeah, this has a good sense of humour, actually, which perhaps unfairly I don't always associate with subtitled films, but this did make me laugh a few times when it wasn't making me sort of tense and scared.
Yeah, they did a good job of walking the line of being, tense and dramatic, and also could be quite funny. There definitely were moments when I did laugh, and there were certainly moments when I jumped and went kind of like, ooh, that was sort of an unpleasant or a shocking bit. The violence, I think, is one of the reasons why it can do both, is that it is very violent, but in a very over-the-top way. Sometimes the violence just becomes comic, almost a bit like Tom and Jerry-like. It's just so over-the-top.
Yeah, it never seemed like ludicrously comic, but there was quite a bit of spurting ketchup, I guess.
Yeah, and sort of zombies kind of throwing themselves over things or at things, or just kind of running into glass doors and things like that. There was just quite a lot of over-the-top sort of violence.
And the zombies had a sort of funny walk they did, where all their limbs were slightly bent out of shape, and it was scary in the sense that the characters were affectionately drawn, and you were clearly meant to care about them, and it did quite a good job of, with the exception of the actual main character, who does get a bit of development, the others are all introduced quite quickly and differentiated, and you get their basic traits, and you actually care fairly quickly. Again, that, I guess, is another sort of basic horror film requirement, and they did it pretty well.
Yeah, they introduced the kind of the other passengers in the carriage that are become your kind of main focus, like as well as the main character Yeogong and his 8-year-old or 10-year-old daughter Soo-an. There's like a guy who's like a bit more working class, and his girlfriend's pregnant, and he takes an instant dislike to Yeogong because Yeogong's like a commodities trader or a stock trader.
Was the main character Yeogong meant to come across as more of a dick? Because maybe I just didn't get quite as much of the inflections because it was subtitled, but the main character didn't come across as a massively self-absorbed business wanker. He just came across as sort of a quite harried, busy everyman.
Yeah, I think they were kind of trying to walk the line of making him have a character journey to go on. So at the beginning, he's like very focused on his job. He doesn't know what to buy his daughter for her birthday.
Yeah.
So it's things like that. And like the one thing she really wants to do is go to Busan to see her mum on her birthday, and he doesn't want to take her. So I think the idea is that he's not supposed to be like an awful person, but he's supposed to be like maybe a bit self-absorbed or a bit career-focused. Obviously, we're talking about a different culture where there's maybe more of an emphasis on sort of workplace advancement and social status ascertained through work. But I think we're supposed to interpret him as kind of maybe he could be a bit of a better dad. He's not terrible, but he's like maybe he could be like a bit better. And then obviously this is a standard kind of almost like a trope of horror movies or action movies that he has to overcome his like personal and interpersonal shortcomings in order to overcome the extra personal conflict of saving his daughter from a train full of ravenous zombies.
I quite liked the escalation of it. I think it did a good job of things getting worse continuously without it ever being boring. Like, there's never a sense that I'm watching the dull bit, but there's always a more exciting bit coming up next.
Yeah.
There were some really good bits towards the end, actually. There was, like, I think at least a couple of occasions, maybe even 3, where I thought, oh, well, that was the big end set piece. The film's basically over. And then there was another even bigger set piece after that. It was like, oh, yeah. Yeah, the last hour or so in particular is really good.
Yeah, I guess it does really ramp up the tension. I think my favourite bit was probably like the end of the second act, which is when the zombies have completely taken over. They pull into a station before Busan, and sort of loads of zombies come for the train, and they're supposed to get off here, but they can't. So they have to get back on the train, but more zombies are on the train now, and they're kind of pushing forward to get to Busan. And some of the main characters, there's kind of there's Yeogong, there's this sort of working class guy who's got a sort of dislikes Yeogong, but they're thrown together. There's a baseball team on the train as well, like a high school baseball team. So there's this kind of teenager sort of baseball player, which is a very handy thing for a zombie movie, that there's a baseball team on this train, which means there's lots of bits of heavy wood around for them to hit zombies with.
Yeah,
it's a great bit. The 3 of them have to kind of fight or trick their way past several cars worth of zombies to rejoin the others. And that was like very tense, really good. Few set pieces worked really well with the kind of claustrophobic nature of a train. The whole thing of a train that there's nowhere else to run to apart from forwards or backwards. There's no way around any obstacles. So that worked really well.
Yeah, there were some good bits where they got past it using trickery. Although there was one carriage, they basically just had to become zombie fighting ninjas and just punch their way through, which did seem a bit odd to me for some reason, I don't know. But yeah, the rest of the time, yeah, there were some good sort of tense bits of trickery there.
Yeah, and then there's a great bit. They get to the other survivors at the front of the train, and the survivors sort of instantly turn on them, think they've been bitten. The way that the survivors get really sort of hostile and aggressive and suspicious of other human beings, it is kind of, again, covers that sort of regular feature of a zombie movie, which is, in some ways, the survivors are worse, that human beings are worse than the zombies, because the way we turn on each other, the way we exploit the crisis and the collapse of authority to kind of be cruel and mean to each other when we should be helping each other. You know, it really tackles that bit quite well, which is a frequent feature of a zombie story.
It's true. I think at this point, however many years into the Walking Dead comic and TV show, I think we've established that the phrase The Walking Dead may not actually refer to the zombies. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's a bit in the comic where the main character loses his shit completely during a dark moment and starts screaming, "We are the Walking Dead!" at all his mates, so yeah.
Yeah, and we very much had one of those moments, but I thought it was done well, so it was like an established feature of a zombie movie, but not done in a tropey or tired way. It was an important part of the film.
Again, yeah, that's another big zombie movie milestone. It kind of makes me want to try the Fear the Walking Dead spin-off, which is set in a sort of more populated world around the time of the outbreak, but all the reviews say that's shit.
Well, I'll say, if you're getting tired of American zombie things, you know, like I say, this isn't winning any sort of massive prizes for originality. You know, it's not an entirely fresh take on zombies as, say, In the Flesh is, or even The Girl with All the Gifts. But I do think that, like, yeah, by seeing a film in a different setting and a different culture does breathe some fresh life into a very well done idea. And, you know, it did feel like original. It didn't feel like I was seeing like another zombie thing. It's just different, you know, location.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's room for Train to Busan 2. This time it's a sleeper train or something. Train to Busan 2 Eurotunnel edition.
Maybe they could set it in the UK and it could be Train to Birmingham. It's not got the same ring. Though Busan is, according to my research, the Birmingham of South Korea. So yeah, that's our English.
Is that what it actually says?
Well, it's the second city, and it's their sort of big industrial city, which is the same as, you know, Birmingham being our second city and our big industrial city. So if we did a British remake, it would be Train to Birmingham, which lacks the exciting nature of Train to Busan.
Well, you don't know that. I mean, maybe in Korea they hear the words Train to Busan and think, oh God, I don't want to see that film. That sounds depressing even before I know there's zombies in it.
That's a good point, actually. I'd be interested to see. Maybe it had a different name.
I mean, it's quite a nondescript name in a way, because obviously this could just as easily be a touching art film about two strangers connecting romantically on the overnight train to Busan.
Yeah.
It could be basically anything. I know it was a terrifying zombie film because you told me it was.
It's a strange one. Because, yeah, the name doesn't sound hugely in sort of inspiring. It's the content that's kind of inspiring. It's possible that, I know a lot of foreign language films, they retitle them for overseas because the literal translation of the title can sometimes sound a bit naff because of different cultural backgrounds. The way they kind of, I know, phrase or present information in other cultures can be different and doesn't survive direct translation, so it's better to repurpose sort of and give it a new title. Like at the London Film Festival, I saw a French film called The Stopover, and the director was saying in France the film was called See the World because it was about the army, and that was an army recruiting slogan. They thought something was lost by retitling it The Stopover, which is less ironic.
Well, it depends. If it's just the French army, then you won't get it, I guess.
No, it was a British army thing as well, I think, at one point. But I don't know.
Okay.
It is also about a stopover. But retitling is quite common, so I don't know if the literal translation of this film's title into English is something different. Because, yeah, Train to Birmingham doesn't fill you with a desire to see the film.
No. I mean, it would still be better than getting a literal Train to Birmingham, but still. Okay, and lastly this episode, we'll be talking about Chew, specifically Chew Volume 1, Taster's Choice. This is the monthly comic series from Image, which, as a matter of fact, the final issue, issue 60, came out yesterday, assuming you're listening to this podcast on release day, and why wouldn't you? So this is the series by John Layman and Rob Guillory from Image Comics, which is about a guy called Tony Chu, who is a cyberpath, which means whenever he eats something, he immediately gets a flash of its entire history, whether it's like fruits growing in the field or animals being slaughtered in an abattoir. And as one does, he uses this ability to solve crimes by, well, biting murder victims, basically. Although, to give the series its credit, over the course of its 60 issues, it does do quite a good job of thinking of new food-based powers or new things for Tony Chu to do. Over the last few years, as Image has become sort of one of the primary producers of sort of big non-superhero comics, this was... I don't know if I could say it's the one that started that trend, but it was certainly one of the first big hits that later paved the way to other things like Saga. And it's now completed its 60-issue run and passed the baton on to the next generation. So, it seemed a good time to get Alastair to read the very first one, or at least the very first 5 issues which are collected in the first book. Alastair, what did you think of it?
This is one of the, I think, more left-field things you've recommended me so far. Yeah, it was, at first I wasn't a bit sure what to make of it, because it's very odd. I'll put it that way. It's very strange. It's not just that he's like the one strange thing in this universe, because he's a bit odd because he can eat food and absorb its memories and stuff. It's just the whole universe is just really weird. Like there's other people with kind of bizarre food-related powers. There's been a bird flu outbreak, which means the government has banned chicken, but there's like an illegal like chicken black market with chicken prohibition and chicken speakeasies. And like the food authorities in America are like the sort of Gestapo people who enforce this. So it is really, really strange. I really got into it after a couple of issues, and I really kind of got over. I don't know. It's not that I was put off by the weirdness. I was just kind of a bit struck from sort of left field by it. I was expecting something a bit more iZombie-like, which is basically pretty normal worlds, just with a slight twist of someone eating brains and solving crimes. But no, this is like a whole. I know, looking at our world through a very distorted mirror of sort of bizarre food-based magic and sort of gritty crime syndicates revolving around cheap fast food places, kind of and dirty junk food and black market chicken. It is like a really great little kind of weird universe they've put together. They sort of do a really good job of like introducing you to quite quickly, so you get familiar with like not only Tony Chu and his strange powers and his personality, but also kind of the wider plot of like how this universe is different to ours and the tensions that produces. So they do a really good job of getting you into that and kind of grounding you in it and then telling you these very strange stories.
Well, yeah, I think, because obviously, as I said, this is the start of like a planned 60-issue run, which they have now done and completed. And if it was just, it's a police procedural, but the gimmick is he bites bits off victims, I don't know if I would think, oh, cool, that's got to be the basis for a good 60-issue story. But because it's this whole world with its sort of its conspiracies and its weird foibles, and there's like hints about vampires and there's some weird cosmic stuff going on as well. And yeah, this does feel like I'm picking out the edges of a bigger world. Obviously, even before they actually did it, you can read the start of this and can imagine how they get a sort of long, complex story out of it.
Yeah, it's quite episodic as well. Like, there were kind of a sort of much more self-contained story in each of the 5 issues that I read. I mean, obviously they do relate together. They build out the world. They tell the story of, sort of Tony Chu and his sort of very bizarre life. But there is kind of a sort of episodic nature to each one, and they kind of have a case or a crime that they're sort of investigating in each issue. It was, a bit different to some of the other stuff I read that was much more kind of arc-based.
I did actually think of this, as I was rereading it myself. It's like, this is probably the first comic I've recommended you that has this sort of, each individual issue is a unit within itself, as well as it going towards this sort of book unit. Because, a lot of the other stuff I've recommended you has been sort of, each issue is just kind of 20 pages of a 120 page story.
Yeah.
And I think it's a bit denser as well as a result of that. There's a lot more going on each page and in each issue. There's not as many splash pages or action shots. There is. I don't know if it took you longer to read. It does take me longer to read than some of the other stuff I've recommended you, just because they're packing more in.
Yeah, I think actually you're very right about that. I hadn't noticed it, but now you pointed out that is true. It is quite densely written and densely plotted because they have a lot to do to tell, like each episode's kind of self-contained plot and push forward the main plot. So it is quite dense. I'm not sure if it took me longer to read. I read it kind of in one long chunk, which is not usually how I read comics or anything else. I usually read in short gasps on like the tube or on the bus. Whereas this comic, I decided I just sit down and read most of it just kind of one Sunday afternoon. So I think maybe the fact that I got into it, I got really sucked into it, mean I could read it faster because it wasn't kind of a reintroduction each time I picked it up. I kind of just sort of hit it in one big chicken leg rather than lots of like little noodles or something.
Yeah. But yeah, no, this is, I think, it must be about the fourth, maybe even fifth time I've read these issues, and they're still just great.
The artwork is really, really good, as well as the writing.
Rob Guillory is great. There's the sort of balance between the cartoonishness and the still selling the serious parts, and the lots of little visual jokes in the background. Because, yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about portraying weird things in a very sort of straightforward, semi-realistic style, and I think... And this isn't that, to be honest. This is displaying the weird things in a slightly more abstract, cartoony style.
Yeah.
Because I think they want to do this sort of note of dark comedy, albeit serious when it needs to be. And a deadly serious chew would be kind of disgusting, I think.
Yeah, it would be. I think, yeah, definitely there's a fact that as this world is stranger than our world, having a sort of slightly abstract style of the artwork was was very good in that it kind of, I know, it helped you believe that this was like a different world where the whole sort of structure and sort of conflict of the world is different to our world. I mean, it's a big contrast to, say, Uber, which is drawn very realistically. In Uber, when someone gets ripped apart or crushed, it kind of looks like what you'd expect that to look like in real life. As you said, if Chew had been drawn with that degree of realism, the scenes when and this is a spoiler, for a plot spoiler, and also something that if you're listening to this over lunch, probably stop listening at this point as well. Like, there's a scene in the fifth issue when Chew has to eat like a dead dog to find out its memories.
Yeah.
And there's quite a lot of bits when he eats bits of people, or sort of bits that have been cut off people, like a dismembered finger, to find out sort of where the poor person that the finger was cut from is. So yeah, if they'd made that done that with a sort of degree of visceral realism, it probably would be a bit too disgusting. But there is something actually almost about the kind of the cartoony sort of strangeness of it that in some ways kind of makes it more disgusting, because it's like a whole world that's kind of weirdly whacked out of shape. It's, I don't know, you get the feeling I wouldn't want to live in this world. I don't think I could stand it.
Yeah, there is a bit in the third issue, I think, where he gets like physically drenched in vomit, which... Yeah, I don't know if I want to see the strictly realistic version of that either. No. Where it just sprays from off screen and covers him.
He gets covered in blood quite a few times as well.
Yeah, which, as I saw recently in class, does just look a bit weird when it happens in reality. It's like, oh, you're covered in red, are you? Okay.
It does look like you've just been paintballing, but just only one colour used.
The vomit paintball is a new innovation that I'm trialling.
Yeah, so it is, I think, it's a really good combination of some great writing and some great artwork. Sort of both, they're both surreal, visceral, quite earthy and quite disgusting but in a glorious way. I think the writing especially is very good. Like I say, it's very odd and it's a very weird world. It's very funny in a kind of, like the idea of having chicken speakeasies is very funny, but also like when it wants to be tense, it really can be very tense. There's crime stories, there's kidnappings, there's murders, and there's a real sense that like when someone's kidnapped I think it's in issue 2, like there really is a life on the line, and Chew has to do all these terrible things in order to save human beings from criminals because he's a policeman. So when it wants to be tense, it really can be tense, and it's got great characterization when it wants to go into the characters, and when it wants to be funny and gross, it can be funny and gross.
Yeah, and I think it's quite clever and heavily thought out as well. Like, as I said earlier, you get the sense of a wider universe, and as well as sort of hints about future storylines, the stuff that's in this issue is built quite cleverly. Like, there's a twist at the end of the volume. I'm not going to spoil it, even though it's like 5 years old, because I don't see any point. But it is really well built. Like, I've read it knowing the twist, because I've read this before, as I said. And you can actually see a lot of hints towards the twist, which you wouldn't necessarily catch if you read it for the first time. I don't know if you did. Yeah, I sort of read that thinking, oh yeah, okay, they're very subtly dropping a hint that something isn't quite what it seems.
I didn't see the twist coming, actually. It took me by surprise, so that's why I thought it was a good bit of writing. I mean, it made sense when it came. It didn't come out of the blue. It was a logical direction to take the story in. I just hadn't anticipated that was going to happen, which I think is part of the good writing, that the first time around it's not obvious what the twist is.
Oh no, I didn't have a clue the first time. No, it took me completely by surprise.
Yeah, that's why I think it is well written. It can be tense and dramatic, and it can be gross and funny. I mean, much like Train to Busan, it does a good job of walking this line of being tense when it needs to be tense, and silly and over the top and funny when it needs to be. And sometimes you, at the same time, with the same subject matter, which is a difficult balancing act to do as a writer and a sort of, filmmaker or a visual artist. but it's well done in both these cases, and that's what makes it a really interesting story.
Yeah, I read up to about issue 45, I think. At this point, I'm sort of waiting for the series to finish, and then I'll probably go back and sweep through the whole thing one last time. But yeah, it does do a really good job of building it throughout the series. I think it's, as these series do, I think there's an extent to which it's become kind of part of the backdrop, but I am really looking forward to just experiencing the whole thing in one big go once it's all over.
Yeah, sort of one massive kind of whole roast chicken sort of hit of chew.
One huge blob of it, yeah, because, as I say, I've read about 3/4 of it, and there's loads of weird food superpowers and strange foodie concepts to come. It's a really good comic. It's one of the best. I'm sad it's over, but at the same time, I'm very happy they got to, finish on their terms and do their ending, whatever it turns out to be.
Yeah, I think that's important, kind of telling a story, setting out to tell this story, building it up, executing it well, wrapping it up and saying it's done, the end. For example, like Breaking Bad did or something like that. Not feeling the need to keep going on indefinitely just for the sake of it.
Yeah, I think that sort of 5-year, 60-ish issue run has become something that a lot of these independent series do to sort of cover their entire arc. And like Preacher did it, Transmetropolitan did it, Why the Last Man did it.
5 years is also a good number for a TV series, 5 solid seasons, then you're out. That's a good sort of length for a dramatic TV show to run.
It's true. I wonder when 5 became that kind of magic number. But I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, it's a good length for anything. It's a good length for Chew. All right, we done?
Yep. I guess this bit you just add in the sound of someone vomiting as the jingle.
I'll see what I can find on freesound.com.
I don't know. It's just to be different.
Okay, so that was Chew. Alastair, what are we talking about in next week's recommendation bit?
Well, we're going to stick with the theme of sort of gritty crime stories, but rather than going for something that's kind of a bit offbeat, a bit surreal, a bit unusual, we're going to go sort of quite gritty, reality-based crime story. I'm going to recommend you Martin Scorsese's 1967 film Taxi Driver. One of my favourite films of all time. It's right up there at the top of my list of favourite films. Really great movie. Stars Robert De Niro in a sort of one of his career-defining early films. He's a Vietnam veteran. He's come back from Vietnam. He's got insomnia, so he takes a job as a taxi driver at night, just sort of driving around New York. And he sort of meets a sort of cast of unusual and quite sort of, in some cases, quite disturbing characters, and he sort of falls into this kind of seedy underworld of New York.
It's another classic film I haven't seen. Does it involve him walking around? I think
there's
somehow absorbed, but it involves him walking around.
There's a lot of him walking and driving around. It's kind of this film, it's like a portrait of isolation and loneliness in sort of contemporary big city. So yeah, he's very isolated. He spends a lot of time walking and driving around by himself, seeing kind of civilization decay around him and going sort of slowly mad.
Cool. Well, I look forward to it. Join us next fortnight for Isolation and Loneliness. Okay, and that was all your moderate fantasy violence for this fortnight. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then feel free to subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher. And if you feel like leaving us a nice review on either of those platforms to help other people find the podcast, then that'd be just awesome. You could also find us online at moderatefantasyviolence.com, which includes all our episodes, plus the occasional bit of extra content, such as essays or written pieces by us, and our excessive fantasy violence clips, including one from the last episode, in which we talk about the nature of The Walking Dead, if you didn't get enough zombies during that Train to Busan section.
We're also on Twitter, where we're at MFV Podcast. We post there regularly. If you want us to discuss anything on the show, or if you have any feedback or something to add, do get in contact with us. You can also find us on Facebook if you search for Moderate Fantasy Violence. And feel free to say hi to us there. I've been Alastair Ball. You can find me on Twitter at Alastair J.R. Ball. You can also go to redtrainblog.com if you want to find more of my writing.
Okay, and I've been Nick Bryan. You can find me as at NickMB on Twitter, or you can go to nickbryan.com for news of my self-published crime books. Okay, and we'll be with you again in a couple of weeks when we're covering Grand Tour, the new Clarkson Hammond's May car show from Amazon. We'll compare and contrast it with Top Gear, which we did ages ago, as well as the new Peter Grant book, The Hanging Tree from Ben Aranovich, the remainder of Season 1 of the teen Doctor Who spin-off Class, and of course we'll be seeing what I thought of Taxi Driver. Okay, see you then. Bye.
Bye.
One of these days I should actually script these intros like Alastair does instead of just wing them. Right, so the film's directed by David Yates, it's written by J.K. Rowling, it's got
It's rolling like bowling.
We had this problem last time.
I don't think it actually came up last time. I did say Rowling a few times and wonder if Claire was going to leap in and correct me, but she didn't.
I was very calm and collected and angry about other things, probably.
I don't know. I mean, compared to a lot of what everyone said after the script came out, our cursed child bit's pretty fucking positive.
Yeah, I know.